Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity, discovery, and the bold new ideas shaping our future. I'm Sibel Raver, Provost of Vanderbilt University. Today, we're revisiting our conversation with acclaimed poet, Major Jackson, through a curated remix of our original episode. Centered on themes of curiosity, creativity, community, and renewal, this discussion explores what poetry can teach us about paying attention, embracing uncertainty, and, in Major's words, finding ways to begin again. Major Jackson is the author of 6 books of poetry, most recently, Razzle Dazzle, New and Selected Poems. And I actually have that book in my office on my bookshelf right by my computer. His edited volumes include Best American Poetry 2019, Renga for Obama, and Library of America's County Cullen collected poems. He's also the author of A Beat Beyond the Selected Prose of Major Jackson. Major is a recipient of fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, the John S. Guggenheim Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. He frequently publishes poems and essays in a host of publications, including The New Yorker, Orion Magazine, Paris Review, Poetry London, and World Literature Today. He serves as poetry editor of the Harvard Review and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was also recently named the inaugural recipient of the Patricia Cannon Willis Prize for American Poetry from Yale Library. Like a favorite poem revisited over time, this conversation offers something new with each return. We hope you'll enjoy listening or listening again. Major, I want to first thank you. This is such a truly amazing opportunity to talk with you about your work, about your vision for the power of poetry and creativity for transformation. Major, I want to spend time reading and discussing several of your poems, and instead of talking about them, I want us just to dive right in.
Great idea.
With the first poem, especially the first poem of this new volume, because I find it so inspiring, so beautiful. So if you could read Let Me Begin Again, I would be honored.
Great choice. Thank you. Let me begin again. Let me begin again as a quiet thought in the shape of a shell slowly examined by a brown child on a beach at dawn, straining to see their future. Let me begin this time knowing the drumming in my dreams is me inheriting the earth, is morning lighting up the rivers. Let me burn my vanities, old music in the pines, snifters of scotch, a day moon like a signature of night. This time, let me circle the island of my fears only once, then live like a raging waterfall and grow a magnificent mustache. Let me not ever be the birdcage or the serrated blade or the empty season. Dear glacier, dear sea of stars, dear leopards disintegrating at the outer limits of our greed. Soon we will encounter you only in motivational tweets. Reader, I should have married you sooner. This time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at breakneck speeds toward sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals to attend. Look closer. I am licking my lips.
So amazing. So powerful.
Thank you.
I could talk about this poem all day. It's just amazing. And I guess the first thing I would love to just say is that I think of this poem as a kind of psychic nourishment. You're providing us with this sort of fortifying intellectual or psychological or imagistic vitamin, some kind of fortifying agent.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I see poems in that idea of Lewis Hyatt's notion of the art as gift, but also, as you put it, something that is reifying for me as well. So when I set out to pull together a collection of poems over 5 volumes and add new poems, in a way I was recommitting to poetry itself. As you know, sometimes we can get thrown off track from the thing that we actually love. So it was such a gift to go back and be reminded of the possibilities of what language can do or what a poem can do in our world. We've known poems to kind of console us. We've known poems to express the inner rage at some injustice. And so me coming back to my old poems, I really feel like I needed to go back to that space where poetry was working so many different registers for me. So in this particular case, with this poem, I really believe in music. And so you get a lot of repetition. And so I'm kind of anchoring that. I'm also high-fiving, in a way, my great concern about the environment. I also believe with that line addressed to the reader that I should have married you sooner, I think poems should also connect to a larger community and not be so inward. And also, I have this strong belief that great art comes out of curiosity, and it also comes out of not knowing the answers, kind of what you were recently talking about, now that I think about it.
I love this sort of sense of there's a humility and a recognition. I love that moment where you recognize our own failings for having had grand thoughts that may have gotten in our own way. Let me burn my vanities. I just love that line. And I love, the let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. So that sense of being open to knowing something for the first time.
I don't know, but for me, someone who lives in a way with this ever-growing sense of our interconnectedness, I think it's immensely humbling to come to a community with not this kind of hierarchical sense of knowledge or wisdom, but knowing that there's a greater wisdom that's born out of exchange.
That's great. It actually allows me to pivot to the question about curation. This title, I believe, is a Philip Levine title, and so you're giving us a quick wink or a tip of the hat to another poet that you'd like us to know more about.
Thank you for saying that. Philip Levine was a very important poet for me and several generations of American poets. And he, born in Detroit, working class poet, someone who wrote very movingly, I want to say, about working class people and people who kind of struggle, but in a way that kind of not politicized them, but wrote with a great sense of dignity. His great volume, What Work Is, which won the 1992 Pulitzer Prize, was a collection that I literally carried in my backpack for a year. And if I pulled it out, you got a sense of who kind of like, it's almost like you're part of the club if you're like...
you flash the cover
flash
at
the cover,
coffee shop.
like coffee, exactly, right? For sure. And his particular, the impulse to title and wink, as you say, really signals something that's been very important to me, is that we have this great tradition of poetry in America. And I'm not sure if we have a regard for past literature like we used to. And maybe it's because there's such a great swath of poets who are of all backgrounds who are writing. But I really believe that we need to celebrate and cherish an art form that gives expression to a wide range of experiences in our country, and that Whitmanian sense of our greatness is owed to our plurality. I so believe in that. And so me winking to Philip Levine, Sonia Sanchez, Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde, it's really me saying, hey, there's an intertextuality here, and I'm not here without them.
Right. So then, of course, I went and read that poem.
Oh, fantastic!
And then I knew you wanted me to, because that's the signal that was sent that you sent in the title, right? And that I then noticed that the end lines of that poem refer to a child, himself as a child, and then I immediately reflect on the first lines of this poem. But I also love that in that poem, he winks at Icarus, it seems, right?
That's right.
At a child flying too close to the sun.
That's right.
And this idea of taking risks and how we have to occasionally face the fact that we failed and that we have to begin again, right? So suddenly I'm in this like wild, whirling set of conversations and references, and I'm so grateful to you for inviting me in, right? As a person who doesn't know that much from an academic standpoint about poetry, that you've brought me in that way. And I think a lot about your role at the Harvard Review and in the podcast. I think I've heard you referred to as curating poems. And I often think about curation. One of the responses that we might have to that word is this idea of someone who selects the highest quality, right? Is sort of a judge, that your judgment matters. But what I hear you doing when I hear you curating is actually sharing, that you're introducing us and bringing us in. And that when you do that in the podcast, you're doing it every day, right? You're on what, 1,188th episode?
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah. My enthusiasm for poetry almost implicitly requires that I serve as an ambassador without that hierarchical sense of taste. I mean, and as you can imagine with the Harvard Review, there's already embedded this sense that I'm going for the highest incarnations of the art. But really, for me, there's several aims and goals for me. One, I do like poems that speak back to a tradition, but I also like poems that are historically based, or I like poems that speak to our kind of quotidian existence, our everydayness. And I'm really excited to know that quite possibly someone can hear something. They may not understand the full poem from title down to the last line, but they'll hear a line and it might just turn the corner for them that day.
Absolutely.
Something that they needed to hear.
Absolutely.
Something that kind of sparks a thought or thinking, or invites them to kind of do the work of deep diving into an area that they hadn't thought about, but they were curious.
Yeah, I mean, I totally resonate with that. So this as both a prayer in a way, let me, had that resonant feeling of prayer, but also conversation. That you address the reader, that you're engaging me in a conversation.
I do consider poetry a sacred, secular conversation.
That's great. So to help, I think, those of us who may not be fully trained in how to read a poem, I'd love you to pull back, sort of, I'm flashing on Wizard of Oz and pulling back that green velvet curtain, right, to show us the mechanics of how a poem works.
Sure.
So, I love, the line that absolutely makes my heart clench is the let me run at breakneck speeds towards sceneries of doubt, right? That's this incredibly intense, speedy, not speedy, but, the poem obviously says it better than I can. But you get us there, I think, by building so much from a slower pace earlier with that quiet child that we don't want to disturb or interrupt, right? And then you circle us around that island. Right? So can you give us a sense of how you structured this poem?
Sure. This poem began when I was thinking about my children. I would take them to Long Beach Island and Atlantic City. And there's that moment where, and you don't have to be a parent, but you can be on that beach and you can see a kid who's so engrossed in what they're holding. It could be a shell, it could be the carcass of a mollusk. And that moment of interiority feels so precious to me. It feels so important. And so when I think the poem, as you know, begins with that Philip Levine, but it's like, okay, what do I want to be? I want to be a quiet thought that a child, we're not used to thinking in a sense, unless, you have a kid who's maybe quietly reading, you look over, but to be that quiet thought and knowing that they are rooted in a space of innocence and curiosity, and knowing that curiosity is going to kind of push them forward in life. And if they can retain that, which we often talk about So I also like the sound of just the short E's, let me begin again. You can kind of hear the slide of vowels there. So, and then I'm using the simile there. We know that because of as, let me begin as a quiet thought. And so sometimes I think it was the poet Derek Walcott who said, once a poet writes those first early lines, they know the sound of a poem. And that's what I'm looking for when I tap the pen to the page. What is going to be the music that emerges? And so in this particular case...
Wow, I flash on you like as a ceramicist, right? Like, you feeling the shape of the pot.
Yeah, truly. Yeah, that's a great image to bring to it. Or the stroke of a brush, the writer or the artist is trying to see what shape is going to emerge in the same way that a ceramicist is trying to figure out that shape. So I hear the sound there. I know I'm going to use anaphora, which is a repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of a sentence rather than at the end of the sentence. So I'm moving through, and now I just want images. And I'm typically an image-driven poet rather than, let's say, someone who's unfolding a poem rhetorically, although I do believe images start to create their own, as you said it, accretion towards a space of enlightenment. And so the images are drumming, morning rivers. I love when morning light hits a river or a sea. I'm pushing forward. And for me, I do feel as though if there's anything that stops us is our fears to speak in a room or to raise our hand or our fears of the other. And if we start to think of our fears as not a country, but something smaller, and so that A of B metaphor, island of my fears, really emerged out of nowhere. And sometimes, let me just say, the act of writing is such a conversation with one's subconscious, like you're not sure where those images are coming from.
Well, and that's so psychological. I'll just interject, right? Because it's that idea that's so, I think, true, which is we're allowed to be in our fear, but only briefly.
That's right.
Like,
that's
you get
truly
to circle the island once.
That's right.
I love that you set that limit.
Right. The raging waterfall, this summer I was in another country, and I just stumbled upon a waterfall and such the power of it and the majesty of it. And I think if we can live with that sense of at least with children, right? We really want them to step into that power. And I need to buy humor. I'm typically not funny, but I laughed out loud when I wrote A Magnificent Mustache. There's something like
of course,
so
I immediately
forward,
looked up at you.
Right? There's something so forward about like someone who's, a very thick, magnificent, or a very kind of like
handlebar.
Handlebar, exactly. Yeah. So I think there's, so I'm moving through these images, and then the pause, the turn to the environment and to the reader and to going to that line that you mentioned, Sceneries of Doubt. I think I'm sure it was the poet John Keats, the English poet, who wrote to, it might have been his brother. No, it was a friend. He wrote to a friend, and he was talking about how we hesitate towards poetry, how poetry is this thing of where people keep at an arm's length. And he wants to encourage people to not, to feel like they need to know the poem and its meaning. And I love this phrase, to live in uncertainty and doubt, which is a very Buddhist notion, right? But in this particular case, I'm calling that up because I want to inhabit that space of doubt and uncertainty as a way of looking for the answers, and also just kind of living a little bit more spiritually rather than irritable reaching and grasping for answers.
Oh, it totally reads that way. It reads like sees life, sees uncertainty.
Yeah. So that was the, as you know, the poem turns an address to the reader, and then it comes back to the reader and say, look, I'm licking my lips, which is a gesture of hunger, which is a gesture of I'm back at it. I'm writing, and my curiosity and my, it's going. All engines are firing. I'm ready to go.
It's such an incredibly moving, great way to start both the volume and my day and our year. It's just, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Quantum Potential. If this conversation resonates with you, I invite you to explore our earlier episodes. We've talked with such an incredible, wide range of experts about democracy, about technology, art, and the future of society. Would you read the one of those? I was thinking maybe Double Major, since it's the last poem in the collection.
Double Major. The impulse to write the poem was kind of triggered by the fact that I wrote a poem called Major and I, which is a assignment from the great Argentinian writer Borges, and because it opened, I thought I would finish the.
Well, wait, say more about the assignment.
Oh, so the assignment. Great. Here we go. So Jorge Luis Borges wrote a poem called Borges and I, in which he has his inner self talk publicly about what everyone knows, the famous writer Borges.
Great.
So he gives space, right? And it's an interesting, great conceit for a poem because, as Whitman says, we contain multitudes, right? There's different sides of us. And the idea of giving voice to one of those speakers, a great imaginative leap. And it's also, in a way, kind of payback in a way, right? So, the famous Borges, the one that you see is the one that gets to gets celebrated. But the Borges, the inner Borges that does the work of writing and imagining and thinking. So I think there was an editor who gave an assignment to a number of writers to take that conceit up. Margaret Atwood wrote something, a number of writers, and he collected them. And unfortunately, I was too young to have gotten that call and include it. So some of us have continued to. Frank Bidart has a great poem called Frank Bidart and I.
What a great, I didn't realize that there was this club assignment, right?
It's very interesting. I have this strong belief that when you take on a job, particularly a poet, there are a set of unnamed, unwritten job requirements. You have to write a sonnet. You have to write an ode. You have to write a love poem. You have to write an elegy. And this is emerging as one of those particular assignments.
That's awesome. You have to kind of show both sides, right? You have to expose the inner as well as celebrate the outer, or mock it, whichever way you're going to go, right?
Exactly. So there's a tone of humor in here, I think, or at least the idea is kind of humorous from the start. But I begin this book, The Absurd Man, with Major and I decide to close it with that same speaker with Double Major, which of course is a pun on our area of academia. So Double Major. I emerge whenever he confuses the lamp for a moon. It is then he thinks of fine bindings and ordered athenaeums. I own his face, but he washes and spends too little time behind his ears. He sees me in the mirror, behind thick clouds of shaving cream, then suddenly believes in ghosts. His other selves are murals in the cave of his mind. They are speechless, yet large. They stare his wishes like summer rain and amplify his terrors like newscasters. What he doesn't know, his dreams are his father's dreams, which are his grandfather's dreams, and so on. They possessed a single wish. He knocks repeatedly on the bolted door to his imagination. Tragically, he believes he can mend his wounds with his poetry, and thus I am his most loyal critic. He trots me out like a police dog. He calls our thirst for pads and pencils destiny. Our voices come together like two wings of a butterfly. On occasion, He closes his eyes and sees me. I am negative capability. The test to all men are created equal. We are likely to dance at weddings against my will. He pulled out the same moves writing this poem, a smooth shimmy and a hop. This page is a kind of looking glass, making strange whatever stone carvings he installed along the narrow road to his interior. I suffer in silence, wedded to his convictions. He would like to tell you the truth about love, but we are going to bed. To bed.
Just love it.
Such a silly poem. I have fun sometimes writing poems.
I love that you do that. I love that you include so much humor in your poetry. And sometimes you do it as a shock. You know, the poems carrying us along on some intensely rich, romantic, or, you know, major metaphor, and then suddenly you'll spin around and mock that voice in a way that is just, it's so great. It's so, it helps those of us, I think, who are new feel so included.
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, poetry can be pretentious sometimes, and I need to undercut that like as often as possible. And all I need to do is just like imagine my grandfather. There's a poem in which I poke fun at, from his perspective, for him to kind of see me in this space. He who was a construction worker, who was born in 1917, you know, he was of a different generation, but he was also very supportive. I want to say that the poem has him poking fun at me and my kind of loftiness. But ultimately, because we shared the same name, he was very proud. He was Major Gooch, who was actually born here in Nashville. But yeah, so I try to, and as I've gotten older, I think the arc of my consciousness, considering the social and economic spaces I come from, the journey has been one in which I've had to look back and wonder, and also look back and wonder and laugh, and also realize this is also fleeting, and it's also a gift, it's a blessing. So it's imperative for me to get all of that as much as I can in the poems.
It's so helpful to hear you speak about that, about bringing it in as a reflection on where you've come from, or where you've lived, or what your family members might say about you. And I think a lot about what you mentioned earlier in terms of our quote unquote, the business we're in university with double major as you know, a pun, because I also thought about you teaching here, right? That in a way you're making space for students to think about how they, you know, are experiencing themselves anew and in a different light, and that's okay. They're not disloyal to their communities of origin or families if they are finding themselves in this elite institution of higher ed. They're not leaving behind oneself they discover a new self. At least that's what I sort of soaked from this page, right?
Yeah. The freedoms that I'm talking about in this poem has to do with agency. You know, this is a poem in which the interior doesn't feel like they have agency, but there's a loyalness. And I was thinking about this quote actually it's from John Berger, but Adrienne Rich quotes John Berger in saying, "Defy the space that separates." And that is also part of what I feel as though when we have students come to an elite institution like Vanderbilt, the hope is that they realize that they don't have to leave behind. They're not being disloyal, but moving forward, there is that imperative to kind of make connections, and hopefully make connections that is going to empower someone else. So the poem, in a way, speaks to the interiority and their aims to kind of serve as a bridge. But right dead in the center of the poem is his father's dreams and his grandfather's dreams. You hear me alluding to all men are created, just this long struggle for African Americans to live in a space in which whatever oppressive forces are at work, it's freedom. And there's something about, I feel like education, I feel like writing, I feel like art, all of it leads towards this ability to kind of articulate a selfhood that is unfettered, an imagination that is unfettered.
That's such a beautiful word, unfettered, right? That you are free to, I am free to, any student here is free to explore and embrace and pursue in ways that are unfettered. What a great word.
And claim themselves in a way that they might not have been able to, which is also part of their journey and their growth. Yeah, it's a very special moment for them.
And in that classroom moment, Major, when you have, I imagine 2 to 3 students who are already fully versed. They know themselves as poets. They know their powers, right? I think of the MFK Fisher, the measure of my powers, right? They know the measure of their powers. But then there are probably 2 or 3 students who have no idea why they've landed in your class, but something drew them, something brought them into that class, something sparked that desire, and they're there, but you can see they're maybe 1 foot out.
Absolutely.
How do you navigate that space as a professor?
You may or may not know my undergraduate degree was in accounting business school at Temple University. And yet the case studies from those classes did not tell the full story. So I found myself taking a lot of English classes. And yet, even though I came from a great high school, college prep, I was one of those students that wasn't sure why I was drawn, but I wound up doing a number of classes in drama, women's literature, and I stumbled into a class with Sonia Sanchez, and she gave the gift of seeing everyone and realizing that we can all be each other's best advocate and bridges towards learning, that we are equally invested in our peers' growth as our own growth. So my way of navigating that is to quickly create the seminar environment where we're asking questions and all of us are guided by this collective search, this not individual, but this collective search for answers.
We get there together.
Yeah.
Amazing. And is it always everyone joining in on a shared goal, or is it occasionally that people are really interested in fundamentally different objectives?
That is, it's both. I think we, so for example, we are looking at in the next week, I'm just thinking about my syllabus because I just
it'd be great.
Finished it. Yeah.
What's the course title?
The course title is a graduate poetry workshop. But as I told them, even though it's a kind of a art-based, studio-based class, we're addressing immense critical questions about language and the power of language and what it can do. And so we're at that level, but then we're going to explore poetic forms and also dive into some of the questions that have animated past poets. So some of my students, when we talked the other day, several of them are indigenous, some of them are second-generation Americans. And so they're coming at this question of language vis-a-vis their own identity and maybe ideologies, but we're centralizing the theme of the course. I would say at the spine of it is how does language, particularly poetic language, interacts with the larger uses of language in various settings and various communities. So they do have their individual, but we're guided by that particular.
It's going to be incredible, right? That
I'm
level
looking forward to
of
it.
engagement and that level of both certainty and viewpoint and difference in viewpoint, but also commonality because they've all got you, right? They're all here and each other.
Yeah.
Really
it's exciting. I'm happy to go back where we started. to begin anew this particular
Exactly.
academic year.
No, I mean, it does, in fact, right? Because it's also, I would imagine you're calling them to see the questions they're asking in a new way. You're calling them to use language perhaps differently than they've had to use language before. That is the function of learning, right? That novice state that you gave us the space to inhabit. So,
and reframing questions, you and I both know, is part of the skill set that we have to constantly learn and come back to.
I think reframing in that moment for us and for your class does exactly what you were saying, right? It gives us space to come up with a new solution.
Yeah.
It's just really exciting in that regard.
Yeah, you and I talked before, but I strongly believe that humanities-based classes are equally laboratories. And in this case, our laboratories, the material is language. And even though they are, they're creative writers, I really want to retitle our department really creative thinking, because the imagination is such a crucial part of the thinking process whenever they're sitting down to write their poems.
Absolutely. I love that how strongly I value discovery, how strongly I value inquiry, and I think we often think of that as an endeavor that's really constrained by scientific methods. But I love your use of literary method, of using language and using creativity as the driving force for that kind of reimagining, that kind of rediscovery, that kind of seeing anew.
Yeah. I think what the podcast, the slowdown, is also helping me to realize. I mean, I think about it as part of the gift economy that creative poems bring to the world. But I'm also thinking about what the show is giving, which is thinking about poems as a mode of inquiry, because we don't stick to a theme. There's various topics that we approach. Often I hear when I go out, I hadn't thought about that before. And it's that I hadn't thought about before more than I love the poem that I'm really aiming for.
Such a great note to end on, Major. That's exactly the right note to end on. I hadn't thought about it before, and I can't wait to learn more.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you to our guest, Major Jackson, the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities, Professor of English and Director of Creative Writing at Vanderbilt, for joining us today.